The newest ISM Manufacturing Index gives updates on the state of the U.S.'s industrial footprint. A new California bill brings salary transparency to the hiring process. And coming up, the impacts of drought on the U.S. agricultural economy and how farmers are working to insulate themselves against the most challenging consequences. This week in B2B. Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. Thanks so much for joining us on another episode of This Week in B2B. We took a week off, but we're back better than ever, so I appreciate y'all tuning in as we go live. Make sure you're heading to our website, MarketScale.com, as you watch to catch up on some of last week's content and get a full overview of all of the various industry verticals that we are covering. We have some of the most consequential stories yet, if I do say so myself, with today's episode. We're talking hiring strategies and policy changes. We're talking food production. We're talking manufacturing and agricultural practices, the real beating heart of the U.S. economy. So I'm excited to dive in. Let's get into the headlines of consequence from the B2B world. Story number one. In its most recent announcement, OPEC and its production allies have agreed to slash production by 2 million barrels per day, marking the biggest cut in oil production since the pandemic. Reacting to soaring U.S. interest rates and reduced U.S. dollar liquidity, OPEC's cut is being interpreted as an attempt to stabilize the global oil market. Since most oil is traded in U.S. dollars, a more valuable dollar means less dollar needed for the same amount of oil. So in turn, creating artificially cheaper oil. Just one of the reasonings Saudi Arabia is giving for the cut. For U.S. businesses who were beginning to grow accustomed to a slump in gas prices and energy bills, oil experts alike agree that businesses must plan accordingly for a spike in utility costs.
For producers, I guess I noted just a second ago, there's the confluence of several issues facing them. The regulatory environment, the price environment, the sustainability of higher prices that they need to weigh, in addition to the fact that their bankers want them to show profitability.
Obviously, oil and oil products and prices for these products are hugely important for many sectors and for many enterprises. And these costs would really trickle down as higher costs for many of them. So, since this is a commodity outside of their control, there really isn't too much that they can do other than trying to control costs, so stringent cost controls and efficiency measures within their enterprises.
For the first time since 1994, the FDA has issued a proposed rule to update the healthy nutrient content label, replacing a largely outdated definition with one that more closely aligns with the 2020 to 2025 American Dietary Guidelines. The FDA's new definition will help consumers identify healthier food choices and likely narrow healthy products to less than 5% of food products on the market. This move is challenging for food producers who must now meet the newly proposed regulations or risk being overlooked by increasingly health-conscious consumers. It's also an opportunity for foods with high nutritional value that weren't getting the label beforehand to now get in on the marketing benefits of a quote-unquote healthy label. Businesses must assess the value of striving for such label recognition, and if they don't, will consumers even care? Our industry experts remain undecided.
There are a lot of companies who are already producing food with the criteria that the FDA has set out that they need to meet. There are a lot of borderline companies or companies who produce borderline food products that they'll go the extra step that it takes to meet the healthy food product marketing claims. And then there are a number of companies who don't do it and they don't care at the moment.
Again, I don't think that this approach is going to make that big of a difference in anything. It might be a negative impact, particularly if manufacturers do feel that's in their best interest to reformulate. You might see higher costs associated with that reformulation that is then passed on to consumers. Again, a shrinking percentage of easily identifiable and recognizable products in the marketplace that say healthy on them, due to the more stringent claim requirements. And so I'm hoping in the future that we can move towards a standardized front of package label that's evaluative in nature and allows consumers to avoid unhealthy products as opposed to identifying healthy ones.
Announcing the passing of Senate Bill 1162, California has become the most recent state to increase visibility surrounding the state's wages and hopefully take some action against pay inequality. California is now requiring all employers to post salary ranges in their job listings, right? This applies to all employers. Employees are the obvious benefactor of such legislation, but what concerns should employers have, if any? Well, businesses now have to rethink their competitive edge in the hiring process beyond perks, benefits, and quality of life metrics, right? If salaries are more visible, it could encourage a pickier hiree. While this could seem like a blow to smaller businesses with less capital to offer competitive salaries, our employment experts reiterated that companies will also benefit from improved wage transparency and therefore trust in the whole job market. The main challenge now is offering a broader value proposition.
Skilled labor candidates are in such high demand, and there aren't as many opportunities to create, flexibility and remote work and different things like that in manufacturing and construction roles that we see with some other, professional services roles. And so the compensation requirements for those positions are rising. So what small companies need to look at is what other reasons would someone want to work there? Being in a smaller company has its competitive advantages of agility, individuality for people, maybe some new opportunities and challenges to stretch their skills. And it's a great opportunity to create an amazing company culture. That's what people look for in addition to salary.
Companies today absolutely need to be paying attention to, are we compensating people fairly? Are we being transparent about that compensation? Are we being fair about it? And is it equal? Are we compensating people equally for equal work? That's what's vital today. And that's what regulatory bodies are going to, if they start to regulate it, that's what they're going to start to do.
U.S. manufacturing decline has been a persistent part of the nation's economic narrative for years now, and World Bank data backs this up. Manufacturing as a share of U.S. GDP has been net falling over the last several decades, losing thousands of jobs in the process. The COVID pandemic, though, for all its disruptions, did spur a boost in manufacturing, encouraging a wave of productive growth as companies took on the challenge of creating PPE, hand sanitizer, and other soft goods. Is that boost in production sticking, though, to the point where it's increasing our manufacturing footprint and encouraging growth overall? Well, I dug into the most recent ISM Manufacturing Index and sourced analysis from some experts in the field to better understand how this most recent report intersects with the short-term macroeconomic climate, but also the long-term decline of the U.S.'s industrial footprint. Let's dig in. The Institute for Supply Management's most recent manufacturing survey, the Purchasing Managers Index, has some nuggets of gold for the U.S.'s industrial sector, but overall reflects a much larger trend across both U.S. manufacturing and the larger U.S. economy, and that would be slowing growth. Here are the most critical findings. The index measures from 0 to 100, with 50 being stagnation, above 50 meaning growth, and below 50 meaning a shrinking sector. September's PMI showed that U.S. manufacturing is still growing in the short term at 50.9%. In fact, it's been growing since the initial COVID recession in April 2022. However, that 50.9 number reflects the slowest amount of manufacturing growth in those nearly 2.5 years. So any pandemic-era recovery in U.S. manufacturing appears for now to be rather fleeting.
There was a big surge in demand for so-called non-durable goods, protective equipment for health workers and so on, soft goods. But that's not really the competitive strength of American manufacturing. Two-thirds of manufacturing employment is in heavy industries, so-called durable goods, cars, steel, machine tools, as you mentioned. And yet those, in general, have not come back.
The most affected metric in the PMI appears to be new orders, which slipped for 11 of the 18 measured industries. Timothy Fiore, chair of the ISM Manufacturing Business Survey Committee, stated that many subsectors have near-term demand rather under control, but are preparing for medium and long-term output softening with hiring freezes and attrition. Therefore, the employment index suffered a major blow as industry heads cite, quote, skilled labor shortages, difficulty finding and keeping employees due to wage increases by competitors, and staffing on the production side, end quote. Some sectors, including 4 of the 6 biggest manufacturing industries like machinery, transportation, food and beverage, and computer and electronic parts, all registered moderate to strong growth, while the overall production index showed slight growth with a 2-point increase. There are some short-term optimistic updates for U.S. manufacturing, but it's evident that industrial producers aren't too confident about future demand. This could still be reflecting the consequences of long-term divestments in domestic manufacturing capacity.
Over the last 20 years, manufacturing has lost about 5 million jobs, nearly a third of total manufacturing employment. We've lost nearly 70,000 factories, also about a quarter of the total in the US, and the average factory is getting much smaller. All of that, it means that there's less manufacturing output. And the single most important cause of declining manufacturing production is the growth of imports and the growth of our trade deficit. Imports are up nearly 75%. Likewise, the trade deficit in goods, which is dominated by manufactured products, is also up nearly 70%. Trade deficit was about $900 billion in 2019, the last year before COVID, and it could reach 1.3, possibly even 1.4 trillion dollars in 2022.
Addressing a shortage of manufacturing jobs, slumping demand, and a mass import dependence is a massive task and will take incredible amounts of pressure on changing trade policy and fundamentally reprioritizing the country's productive forces. On one end, you have free trade deals like NAFTA and USMCA, which have only encouraged a hemorrhaging of local production.
We've already created the rules multinationals are using to globalize, with all the negative impacts that's had on jobs and factories and supply chains, making us more vulnerable to disruptions. I think the key is to instead begin to make fundamental shifts in industrial policy.
U.S. manufacturing is also, unfortunately, beholden to the consequences of an overvalued dollar. Factors like long-term foreign investment in U.S. stocks, treasury bills, and other assets, along with the Fed's short-term demand destruction, which is curtailing domestic business investment and attracting even more foreign investment into the U.S. via high interest rates, have overall and in turn overstimulated the dollar's value. And this has made U.S. manufacturing less competitive on the globalized marketplace.
The U.S. dollar has recently reached the highest level it's seen in the past 20 years or more. I think it's actually at the all-time high in my view. And this is going to affect manufacturers going forward down the road for probably 2 or 3 years. So we have not seen the worst yet of the import flood.
Now, the current administration has made one of its campaign promises a resurgence of U.S. manufacturing through federal investment. This has come in the form of the CHIPS Act and the anti-inflation bill, which will stimulate the U.S.'s footprint in emergent and increasingly important industries.
I've seen estimates there are going to be something between 20 and 40 new factories for batteries built in the U.S. and electric vehicles. Those are really just a drop in the bucket compared to the 70,000 factories we've lost over the last 20 years and the headwinds the manufacturers are facing.
Now, in the short term, the PMI index reflects that manufacturers are doing the best they can given current macro conditions. There's still growth, even if it is slow. But to dramatically turn this ship around, right, and to turn the U.S. back into an industrial powerhouse on the global stage where we see decades of increased growth or at least higher peaks year over year, it'll take something more substantial and fundamentally alien to the nation's current manufacturing strategy.
The simplest thing we could do is to create a new tax on those excessive capital inflows that I talked about. And that could and would dramatically lower the value of the dollar relative to other currencies and help restore the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturing. That's a fundamental change that can help rebuild U.S. manufacturing. I think that in addition, if we make even larger investments in clean energy and infrastructure, both of which are greatly needed in the U.S., these will also help build demand for domestic manufactured products. So my research has suggested we could easily add 2 or 3 million manufactured jobs that would both help restore the sector, rebuild devastated parts of the country in the Midwest and the South that have suffered most, in rural areas as well. And of course, it would also help restore the growth of productivity and output per worker.
We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, the main course, right? Drought is holding U.S. farmers' yields hostage. How severe is this heat wave on U.S. agriculture, and what strategic actions are possible for farmers and ranchers? Our interview and analysis with Mac Marshall from the United Soybean Board after this.
When I first started in the sports industry, I immediately realized that there was a serious problem that I had to solve. Baseball's too long, too slow, too boring. We wanted it to be fun, exciting. So we had to create that experience to make it where fans would come out to the ballgame and tell everyone about the time they had with us. People are focused so much on their own growth, their own revenue. They don't put their focus on their customers and how to turn them into fans. When you turn your customers into fans, they do all the marketing for you. They are telling everyone about you, and you create a remarkable experience where that is what wins in the end. I'm Jesse Cole, and I'm the owner of the Savannah Bananas, and this is Fans First by MarketScale.
All right, folks, thanks for sticking with us. It's time for our main conversation of the show. So as reports have been explaining for the last several weeks now in a more focused fashion, and really over the whole summer, it's a very difficult time for American farmers and American ranchers. Right now, over 60% of the American West, Southwest, and Central Plains are categorized as D3, which is severe drought or higher. And this is affecting a substantial portion of not only the U.S. Agricultural economy, but even more so specific slices within that economy. So we're talking 74% of beef cattle, which is responsible for 18% of U.S. agricultural production by value. We're also seeing 50% of dairy production facing some of these issues, which is 11% of U.S. agricultural production, and over 80% of wheat production by value, over 70% of vegetable, fruit, and tree nut production by value. I mean, we're seeing a massive cross-crop and sort of cross-industry impact here from the level of drought we're seeing across the U.S. And a new American Farm Bureau Federation survey from a few months ago puts this more into perspective. What we see is that each metric saw an increase in adverse factors year over year. And I'll list out a few of the key ones. A reduction in harvest yields, up 74%. Respondents, right? 74% of respondents say that they saw a reduction in their harvest yields compared to 72% last year. We see 42% of respondents say they have an intention to switch planned crops for growing season, above 37% from last year. And prevalence of tilling under crops also up. Prevalence of removing or destroying orchard trees and other multi-year crops also up significantly. That one, 33% over 17% year over year. So naturally, there are compounding factors here. And what we wanted to do is pose some questions and have an analytical discussion here for This Week in B2B to give some answers to how are farmers and ranchers already responding to this high level of drought. What's working? What isn't working? Which crops are under the highest threat? And what can farmers be doing in the short and the long term to build resiliency, not only for their own income, but also for the stability of their crops? Here to give us some perspective is Mr. Mac Marshall. He's Vice President of Market Intelligence at the United Soybean Board. Mac, great to have you back on. How you doing?
I'm doing wonderful, Daniel, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. You know, this is a very important topic, and we've sourced you in the past to comment on some of the more recent pro-farmer reports around soy and corn yields, which we'll bring back up here in a little bit. But what I want to do is start by just digging in a little further into this AFBF survey, because I think it really highlights just how prevalent this issue is across the entire agricultural sector. So again, the main survey is showing that across many metrics, drought is impacting several layers of agricultural production and farmers and ranchers' stability. Since we're clearly seeing that farmers are indicating that things are in bad shape, I'm curious if, based on your own analysis, yields are reflecting the same thing, right? How drastic is this in practice, and how is it impacting production numbers, just based on what you're seeing and general sentiment from the farmers and the ranchers out there that are making this happen?
Yeah, it's a very relevant topic. I think not just this season, but really any season. Even if we're not experiencing drought, the threat of it is always there. And of course, this year, as you mentioned, as it's well documented in the AFBF, or American Farm Bureau Federation study, the impacts of drought have really been cross-cutting across a number of sectors. You talked about livestock. Certainly when livestock is under heat stress, weight gain in meat animals and milk production and dairy cows, that tends to suffer. And then, of course, you have the impact on crops. Now, zooming in, I think specifically on soybeans here, earlier in this year, over the course of the season, we got off to a bit of a slow start in terms of planting. We had a lot of rain early on in the spring, which delayed planting, particularly in the Dakotas. And then, of course, as the season went on, we saw pockets of drought and dryness and heat stress across much of the country. I think at one part of the season, up to 30% of total soybean area under cultivation in the United States was actually facing some form of acute drought pressure. Now, where we are now, we're looking at a yield of about 50.5 bushels per acre as of the latest supply and demand estimates that USDA has put out. That is a reduction from where some of the prior estimates were, as there's additional analysis and consideration of the impact on drought and the heat stress has had on crop production. But if we consider soy in a broader ecosystem of agricultural production, which I think is important, because when we talk about soy farmers, we're not talking about farmers who farm only soy. Nobody farms just soy. It is part of a broader system of cultivation. And particularly in the United States, most areas in which soy is cultivated, it runs in a corn-soy rotation. And the reason for that is farmers need to manage that nitrogen cycle. Corn is, of course, a very thirsty crop. That's not denigrating it. It's simply talking about a biophysical property of corn itself. But it does require a lot of nitrogen. And soybeans, as a legume, they actually fix nitrogen into the soil. So, as corn can deplete it one season, soy can help put some of it back. But of course, you do still need fertilizers as well to maintain a healthy overall profile agronomically. And I think that's another important factor worth bringing in. If I rewind the clock to this time last year, when we're in harvest season, when farmers are starting to make their initial decisions, look at the economics, look at the availability of inputs, and build their crop plans for the spring when we get to planting season, last year, fertilizer prices were incredibly high. And for producing corn, you need a lot more fertilizer than you do for soy. So the question was, okay, as margins are really compressed on corn, even as prices are strong and even as prices are strong for soy, does that lead to an area shift where you have a lot of acres potentially moving from corn into soy? Based off of those returns. And, if you're just focused on the economics, if you're just focused on the dollars that farmers are going to bring back on the strength of their production on a per acre basis, you might miss the whole picture, because farmers are considering not just the economics of production, but also the agronomic factors. Nobody farms for a single season. If you're going to have anything that produces something, be it a machine or be it the land itself, which is effectively a machine for growing plants, for growing crops, you need to keep it in optimal working condition season after season after season. And to do that, incumbent upon that is managing the nitrogen cycle.
Right,
so even as markets may have been calling for an increase in soy acres this last year, maybe at the expense of corn, most farmers I talked to wanted to stick in pretty close to a 50-50 rotation between the two for managing that. So that's one thing I think that farmers are doing across the country that is agronomically sound and helps, steward the resources that are in the soil. I think it's also worth noting that in the U.S., we absolutely benefit from being a robust and diverse producer of a lot of agricultural products. You listed a number at the top of the episode, everything from livestock and meat to horticulture to fruits and vegetables to, vineyards, and of course, row crops, which is where I sit. And, as we think about the blessings and bounties that we have as a country in being able to produce such a diversity of agricultural products, we also have to consider, I think, the responsibilities that we have as a producing country and some basic realities. The rest of the world does look to the U.S. as a paragon of, best practices in many ways. So, and that's not saying we always get everything right as a country or as an operator, but that is the view that other countries around the world have. And I'm hearing this directly from participants like that in recent forums that I've got to participate in, that have focused on food security, that have focused on how agriculture can navigate an ever-changing climate and potentially be a vector for climate change mitigation. So we've had some really exciting news, in the past couple weeks where, as the U.S. government, as USDA has rolled out its partnerships for climate smart commodities program, actually the United Soybean Board, in conjunction with the American Soy Association, the Corn Growers Association, and National Pork Board, we've established this coalition called the Farmers for Soil Health, which is a recipient of a $95 million grant from the government that is designed to help expand the use of cover crops on up to 30 million acres by the end of the decade, which is substantial. Cover crops are critical in many parts of the country for securing and maintaining soil health, which is, of course, not just good for nourishing crops in subsequent seasons, but also helping restore the overall health and balance of the soil, so you have that nice microbiome that can continue to be productive and create a beneficial ecosystem overall. And
well, you did a great job of teeing up all of the thematic topics we're going to break down further here. You mentioned the agricultural practices that encourage healthy crops. You mentioned the diversity of the agricultural economy here in the U.S., and also some of the strategies that have a federal tone, right? Funding from the federal government or from state governments, or lobbying from industry organizations to try to encourage investment that builds resiliency in these practices. We'll be touching on all of that here in a second. I want to highlight the effect of drought on sort of the short and long term of the crops themselves and some of the economic and also agricultural practices that are being disrupted here. So if we go back to that AFBF survey, we see that the percent of respondents that reported that they are having to remove orchard trees or other multi-year crops from their portfolio of crops was stark in states like Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, and especially California, where we saw 50% of respondents say that drought affected them in this way. So naturally, when there are impacts on multi-year crops and they're having to remove some of these trees, that not only has a short-term effect, but it can naturally have a long-term effect where rebuilding that momentum could take some time. What are your thoughts here on some of the long-term consequences of this short-term drought crisis?
Well, let's open the aperture a little bit there. Now, soybeans are of course they're not a perennial crop. They're annual. They get planted each year. But that doesn't mean that what you were describing in terms of weather impacts on perennial crops being a challenge. And I think a really illustrative example of this is if we think about soybeans. Soybeans exist within a global complex of a number of vegetable oils. The most the vegetable oils that are produced in the greatest quantity with the greatest international trade are, of course, soybean oil, rapeseed oil or canola oil, sunflower seed oil, and palm oil. Now, the first three crops there are all produced on annually, right? You replant them each year. Palm is a permanent crop. It is a crop that has basically 15 to 25 year life cycle, and there are periods of acute higher productivity out of trees, and there are periods of lower acute productivity out of those trees. And over the last couple years, really the last decade, we've seen yields across the major palm producers, and Indonesia and Malaysia account for about 80+% of global palm oil production. We've seen yields stagnate to even be on a slight downward trend over that period as you've been in an older part of the tree cycle. Some of that is, of course, induced by weather. Some of that is just productivity, crowding of land, all that sort of thing. But as you've had shortfalls in palm oil production, and that's been was exacerbated by COVID for reasons in terms of getting labor availability to actually harvest it. That in turn has knock-on effects for the rest of the vegetable oil complex. Had helped spur prices a lot higher across some of the other oils. So even if it's on the other side of the world and there's weather impacting it, it does factor into soy. Now, staying with soy for a minute as well, but also thinking about weather factors and drought, we saw a tremendous spike in soybean prices earlier this year when it became very apparent that the second consecutive year of La Nina was really impacting South American production. At one point, Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil, of course, the world's largest soybean producer, Argentina number 3 after Brazil and the US, collectively, those three countries were looking at a crop size of over 200 million tons. And, with drought pressure and a lot of acute dryness through much of Brazil and northern Argentina and Paraguay, of course, that crop didn't come to fruition. You lost about 30 million metric tons of production. And when you take that volume out of production, it makes global balance sheets a lot tighter. Prices start to rise. And in some cases, that can incentivize more production in other parts of the world. That was, I think, an open question as we were heading into planting season in the U.S. But in the U.S., we can't backfill that incremental 30 million metric tons that was lost in South American production by putting more land into production. We don't have the luxury of doing that, nor is it ecologically responsible to do so. We have to work within a fixed area boundary in the U.S., which really underscores the importance of implementing these climate smart practices so that the land on which we're producing can produce most efficiently year after year after year.
Right. So then to turn the attention back to soy, which is where your expertise lies, and last time we sourced, we were talking drought impacts over this last growing season on both soy and corn. When we look at corn, like you said, it's a thirsty crop, and unfortunately drought led to a lot of kernel abortion, but we did see soy hold out, and if anything, there are indications that production might reach some peaks. So things look actually relatively positive for soy, even among this high level of drought across the U.S. So obviously, compared to corn, it requires a little less water, not as thirsty of a crop. So there's some strength there that we can point to. But on these climate conscious practices, are there any of those practices or any other strategies that we can learn from when looking at the soy crop that has built resiliency that other farmers, in their larger portfolio of crops can take note of?
Well, soy, I think, has been a crop that has benefited from a lot of technological innovation and investment over the last 30 years that has helped enable adoption of some of these climate smart practices. Now, do we want to continue to scale them up? Absolutely. But for example, one of the most important practices that can be implemented for securing soil health and helping sequester carbon, within the soil, is the adoption of no or limited till, or no till or limited tillage. And I mean, if you think about that, if you're limiting the number of passes that a farmer has to go through their field to to till it up post harvest to get rid of any residual weed that might be there, or to apply additional chemistry for managing pests, additional fertility. All of these are incremental passes through the field, where through the advent and adoption of biotechnology, which came on really strongly in the late 90s here in the US, that's effectively enabled farmers to have greater efficiencies in their actual operations, where you don't have to run the tractor through the field as many times. You don't have to tear up the field post harvest to get rid of weeds. You can simply spray over top of it and kill the weeds post harvest there. So that's one thing where soy and corn have both benefited from having herbicide tolerant trait packages that allow for that over the top chemistry application. Not every crop falls into that bucket, but I think corn and soy can serve as a nice example of how, when you have investment in technology that leads to labor saving and higher efficiency practices, it also has knock-on sustainability or positive sustainability and positive environmental effects as well.
And let's go back to what you mentioned earlier as well about there being a lot of intentionality in the crop portfolio and in the cycle of switching crops out throughout the growing season, throughout the year, to maintain not only healthy soil, but also maximize the production of each of those crops. We saw a lot of farmers take on hemp as of late as a supposedly drought-resistant crop that can bolster income. It's in high demand. It has a lot of cross utility across different types of products and goods and commodities. However, recent reports show that even hemp is struggling to maintain its yields with the level of drought that we're seeing. So any further analysis there on other crops that we should be considering as strategic ones to build some of that income resilience and build, drought resilience across the crop portfolio? And any thoughts on hemp, and its role in that larger strategy?
And candidly here, I think this is where I'm going to get a little bit over my skis, because
Sure.
I'm not an agronomist or plant scientist. So the comments around hemp there, I really just kind of have to take at face value. But I will say that one of the reasons why we put such an emphasis on cover crops is, those, and that could be things like, Brassica carinata, camelina, there are other ones which also have potential applications in biofuels. So those could potentially both help with, with climate saving and soil improving, carbon sequestering practices, while potentially providing revenue streams for farmers as well. I mean, there's still kind of a back and forth on, can it be a cover crop and, also be a revenue stream for a farmer? But I think anything that's going to induce practices that are going to be better for the climate, something that we want to have the right market mechanics in place for. I want to go back to something from a few minutes ago, and we were talking about diversified cropping and how soy has been able to kind of weather the storm, no pun intended, pretty well over these last 2 years. Now, if we think back to 2021, we were really looking at an even worse drought condition than we were in 2022, and wound up producing a record crop that year. Now, our crop size is down a little bit this year with lower overall yields, but we're still on track to produce maybe the fourth largest crop on record. About a month ago, and this is before harvest had really started to kick off and get into full swing. I was on a panel with a couple of farmer directors from the United Soybean Board and the American Soybean Association, and from different parts of the country. There's one farmer from North Dakota, one from Kansas, one from Illinois. And as we kind of had a check-in at this event and said, hey, tell us what your farming operations look like. What are the crops looking like where you are? Each farmer talked about the weather impacts that they had seen over the course of the year, whether it was, flooding early on, or whether it was, dryness throughout the course of the season. And each of them, despite the different geographies, soy was what was holding up really well. The word resilience, if you had that on your bingo card, you probably checked it off pretty early and many, many times throughout the course of that conversation. The soybean is exactly that. It is an incredibly hardy and resilient legume that, can I think weather a lot of these impositions pretty well. But that's not to say that it is an entirely invincible crop. We've seen that come to fruition very strongly in South America this year. So you can't ever take a harvest for granted. The adage, "Don't count your chickens before they're hatched." Well, you can't you can't count all the beans until they're off the combine and in the bin. But I'd say we are generally, well positioned to, manage through a lot of weather impacts. But that's not to say that in the future we'll have that same resiliency. That's why we have to build for it and advance it now, and implement more and more of these climate friendly and carbon sequestering practices that help make that piece of equipment, the most critical piece of equipment all farmers have is the land, that make it more resilient. So when we have, increased volatility in weather events, as has been a trend as climate change has accelerated, we have to build a resilient system that can not only withstand that, but can potentially also be a vector for mitigating that kind of climate change and that future climate volatility.
And that's the key there, right? Proactive investment that addresses and builds resilience, like you said, for the long term. To close things out, I want to throw another example your way. As I was doing research for this interview, I found one sort of new agricultural strategy here that really caught my eye. And I know your expertise here is not really on necessarily the viability, down to the scientific level of all of these strategies. But I'm going to pose this up to ask a different question. So what I saw was this one called My Land. Basically, it's a strategy that focuses on improving the health of soil, which naturally allows for increased profits for farmers. The breakdown of it is, quote, local algae is extracted from the soil and then cultured out and reapplied as an agricultural amendment. And then it explodes its volume and population so it can be reapplied in a really dense matter, end quote. Apparently is particularly useful in arid climates. It was launched in Arizona to, pretty consistent success. Now it's starting to make its way into the Texas Panhandle as a strategy. So I pose this up as an anecdotal example because being on the soybean board and working with public entities, what would you say are some strategies for even implementing something as different and unique as a strategy like this, right? Which includes things like training growers on how to execute on these strategies correctly, right? Achieving the right kind of funding, measuring and testing these strategies with intention so that the whole industry can learn whether or not it's even worth doing the training and the funding in the first place, right? What are your thoughts here on launching new strategies and how to do so with intention to maximize success?
It's a fantastic question, and I appreciate you bringing up the example there of My Land. It was not something with which I had familiarity. It seems like the geographic base at which that's presently targeted, isn't necessarily soybean growing area, but I think the fact that that kind of product exists in the marketplace is representative of, that aforementioned technological advance, which is continually needed. So at the United Soybean Board, what we do, or rather what our farmer directors do each year, is make a critical set of decisions about what they're going to invest in for on-farm research all the way to domestic and overseas marketing and promotion. And we look at that from a couple different lenses. We look at it for health and nutrition, infrastructure and connectivity, and innovation and technology. And in the health and nutrition side, that's how can we best build a portfolio that's going to be beneficial for U.S. soy farmers and the soy complex as a whole, that keeps an emphasis on human health, on animal health, on plant health, and on soil health. And that's where, bringing this all together as we think about some of the, supply side crunches and price spikes that have happened on the input side and fertilizers, we have to think about what are the next generations of products that can benefit farmers here? Does that mean a greater emphasis on biologicals, on microbials, on other means of introducing advanced soil health and plant growth opportunities? What you mentioned there with Myland, I think is something that's very intriguing and representative of exactly the sort of things that our farmers are looking at in their portfolios when these novel ideas come to us, and we start to consider, hey, does this have applications for soy? Can this take off? Can we do all the measurements and everything that you said that can, advance uptake if these things do, have adequate proof of concept and can work in the market and advance things for farmers? That's exactly all the sorts of decisions that we're looking at. I used to work in agribusiness for Monsanto and Bayer as the companies, first Monsanto, then Bayer. We would always talk about the 40 decisions that farmers are making every year throughout the course of, planting to harvest to, maximize their crop potential. Well, U.S. soybean directors are making a lot of other decisions as well. And that's about not just what's happening on their farm, but how they can best set up the industry going forward through making those strategic investments and looking at opportunities for new technologies, new means of promotion, and new research.
And I think on that note, Mac, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. I think, to really build some of these resilient strategies that you've been describing today, that have a proactive lens and that really address the various layers that go into building crop resiliency in the first place, it's going to take collaboration across the industry. It's going to take learning from, other producers, a lot of conversation, a lot of trial and error, but also the right kind of funding and the right kind of training and the right kind of infrastructure support, right, from federal and state governments and from, organizations like the United Soybean Board to help direct and guide and really listen to where farmers are struggling and hopefully provide some solutions for support, right? So we'll go ahead and wrap up there. Mac Marshall, Vice President of Market Intelligence for the United Soybean Board, thank you so much for your time and perspective today. If folks want to learn more about some of your research or tap into the resources for the USB, where can they go? How can they learn more?
Well, absolutely. It was a pleasure being on the interview, and I encourage your viewers and listeners to check out unitedsoybean.org, where we report out on a lot of the work that we're doing. Great resource for learning more about soybeans and farming. We've got a lot of data there, a lot of studies, as well as just some great interviews where you can hear directly from farmers. I mean, it's one thing to talk to me as an analyst. It's quite another to hear directly from our farmers and their on-farm experiences, because everything we talked about here, we're talking about it, they're living it.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself, Mac. Mac Marshall, VP of Market Intelligence at the United Soybean Board. Thanks again. We'll chat soon.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to this week's episode of This Week in B2B. We'll be back next week with more trends, topics,